For centuries, scholars have accused the Apostle Paul of playing dirty with the Bible. Critics claim he took the ancient story of Abraham, flipped it entirely upside down, and essentially lied to his followers to win a theological turf war.
Yeah, that is a huge accusation. But welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are taking a custom-tailored look at the source material you provided, analyzing it from top to bottom. This is the part of the show we call the deep dive.
Right, and today, for you, the learner tuning in, we are looking at a highly specific academic text that tries to solve this massive historical riddle. We are drawing from the book Paul and the Gentile Problem by Matthew Thiessen, focusing specifically on the chapter titled, Do Not Hear the Law.
And it is a controversial chapter because it tackles a very uncomfortable accusation against one of the most famous figures in history. Modern biblical scholars, folks like Richard B. Hayes, they look at Paul's letter to the Galatians, and they suggest Paul is doing what Hayes calls hermeneutical jujitsu.
Which is really just a polite academic way of saying Paul is cheating, right? I mean, the issue centers on Galatians chapter 4. Paul uses the Genesis story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar to argue against Gentiles getting circumcised. He tells these non-Jewish converts they should absolutely not undergo the procedure.
Yeah, but if you open up the book of Genesis, specifically chapter 17, and read it on its face, it seems to mandate circumcision for literally every male in Abraham's household. No exceptions. Slaves, foreigners, everyone.
So the scholars ask this huge question. Was Paul just a duplicitous reader? Was he backed into a corner, desperate to win an argument, so he just twisted the scriptures until they said what he wanted?
That is the charge, for sure. Our mission today is to figure out if Paul was making things up out of desperation or if he was actually a brilliant exegete. Someone pulling the true intended meaning out of the text, interpreting it faithfully. We need to find out if the hidden logic of his argument actually holds up.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can judge Paul's reading of the Bible, we have to understand the fight he was picking. What is happening on the ground in Galatia?
Well, we have to establish the historical context, or nothing Paul says will make sense to you. Paul is writing to Gentiles in the region of Galatia. These are people who were not born Jewish. They are converts to this new movement centered on Jesus.
Right, but Paul is not the only voice in their ear. There are rival missionaries actively persuading these Galatians. These rivals are preaching a different message, telling these Gentile believers that faith in Christ is good as a starting point, but to enter the covenant, to become full members of God's family, they need to undergo circumcision and adopt Jewish law.
Exactly. I mean, that is spot on. But to grasp that, we have to understand the stakes.
Hold on a second, though. I need to push back on this premise. We are talking about ancient surgery. In a world without anesthesia, without modern sterilization, without antibiotics, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. Why on earth would adult men voluntarily undergo such a painful, risky procedure? It feels completely counterintuitive.
Yeah, I get that. You are looking at it through a modern medical lens. To understand their motivation, you have to look at their psychological and spiritual reality. These Galatians were formerly pagans. They lived in a world they believed was populated by malevolent cosmic entities, what Paul refers to as the elements of the cosmos.
Oh, wow. So it's a terrifying worldview.
Totally. Being a Gentile in the ancient world meant you were vulnerable. You were out in the open, subject to the whims of fate, capricious gods, and dark spiritual forces. You had no cosmic roof over your head.
So they were living in a constant state of anxiety. Like if the crops failed or a child got sick, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a demon or a local deity cursing you.
Precisely. Now, contrast that terrifying existence with becoming part of the Jewish people. Joining the covenant offered a massive level of cosmic security. It was an ancient version of a life hack. By bearing this physical mark, they believed they were shedding their vulnerable Gentile status.
They were gaining full access to the covenantal promises and absolute protection from those chaotic spirits. So the rival missionaries were pitching this procedure not as a punishment, but as a mechanism for wholeness.
Right. And I want to make sure we understand the pitch. The missionaries are opening up Genesis 17, and they are pointing to Abraham. Abraham wasn't born Jewish. He was a Gentile from Ur.
Yeah.
And God comes to him and says, walk before me and be blameless.
Yes, and the Hebrew word there in Genesis 17 is tamim. When that word was translated into Greek, the language the Galatians actually spoke, it became telios, meaning whole or complete, or emptos, meaning without blame.
Yeah, so the missionaries were saying, look at Abraham. He was just like you, a Gentile. Then he got circumcised and he became whole. He became complete. Do you want to be complete? Do you want to be blameless?
Let me try an analogy here. Think of it like an exclusive club offering a VIP membership upgrade. The Galatians have the basic entry pass, but they want the platinum card. The initiation fee, which is literal surgery, is incredibly steep, maybe even
Oh,
dangerous.
absolutely dangerous.
Right. But the lifelong benefits of belonging to an ancient, divinely protected lineage seem completely worth the cost to them. You get the sign in your flesh, and boom, you are an heir of Abraham. You get the cosmic security detail. The demons cannot touch you anymore because you belong to the creator of the universe.
That VIP membership analogy captures the psychological appeal perfectly. And to back this up, we can look at texts from that era.
Yeah.
There was an ancient Jewish text called the Book of Jubilees. It supports this specific concept of cosmic protection.
Okay, I have heard of that. What does Jubilee say about it?
Well, Jubilees suggests that God placed angels and spirits to rule over all the other nations of the earth.
Hmm.
And those spirits often lead the nations astray. But God alone rules directly over Israel. So circumcision was viewed as the physical boundary line.
It moved a person from the domain of chaotic, lower-level spirits into the direct, protected care of God himself. So the missionaries are preaching a very optimistic, universalistic message. They are saying, anyone can join this protected family. Just do what Abraham did.
Yeah, that is their whole argument.
But this brings up a massive question for our source text. If the missionaries have such a solid, literal reading of Genesis 17 to back up their VIP upgrade, the text literally says Abraham circumcised every male in his household, including the slaves and the foreigners. How does Paul fight that?
That is the big problem.
Right. How does he argue against adult circumcision without just throwing the book of Genesis out the window? He looks like he is trapped by his own scriptures.
He would be trapped if you were only reading the headlines. But Paul asks the Galatians to read the fine print of the contract. He goes back to Genesis 17, and he points out something the missionaries are conveniently ignoring. Genesis 17 does not offer a blank check for adult converts.
There is a catch.
A huge one. It contains a highly specific temporal stipulation. When God establishes the covenant of circumcision in Genesis 17, verses 12 through 14, the text demands that covenantal circumcision must occur on the 8th day after birth.
The 8th day. Not the 7th, not the 9th, and certainly not the 35th year of life.
The timing is non-negotiable. In the Greek Septuagint, which is the translation Paul and his readers used, the text is explicit. An infant not circumcised on the 8th day is cut off from the people. The priestly writer of Genesis 17 provides very few details about the mechanics of the surgery. We do not get a medical manual.
But the writer hammers home the timing repeatedly. 8th day. 8th day, that specific timestamp is the stipulation that makes the act covenantal.
Yeah, and that actually explains a lot. But it leaves a glaring anomaly in the Genesis text. What about Ishmael? Ishmael was Abraham's son, and he was circumcised, but he was not 8 days old. He was circumcised at the age of 13.
And you mentioned the slaves and foreigners in Abraham's house earlier. They were all circumcised as adults on that very same day. So did they get the inheritance?
No, they did not, and that is the devastating point Paul is making. None of the adults circumcised that day inherited the covenant. God explicitly tells Abraham that the covenant will be established with Isaac, who was not even born yet, not with Ishmael.
Having the surgery does not automatically make you the heir.
Right. The missionaries are telling the Galatians to get circumcised to become heirs. But the story of Ishmael proves that not all circumcisions grant covenant status.
So wait, let me piece this together. Paul is looking at the Galatians, these adult men contemplating the surgery, and he is saying, who are you trying to copy?
What's fascinating here is the brilliant, inescapable logic Paul employs. He holds up a mirror to the Galatians. He asks them to think critically about the ritual they're about to undergo. If a Galatian adult gets circumcised today, whose circumcision are they mimicking?
Oh, wow. They cannot possibly mimic Isaac. Isaac was an infant, circumcised exactly on the 8th day. An adult Galatian is mimicking Ishmael, who was circumcised at 13 years old.
Yeah. So by trying to buy the VIP upgrade, they are actually buying the wrong package. By replicating the wrong procedure, a delayed adult circumcision, the Galatians are not writing themselves into the covenant.
They are actively writing themselves out of it. They are branding themselves as outsiders. They become modern-day Ishmaels, men who bear the physical mark but do not possess the inheritance.
Their chosen method of inclusion guarantees their exclusion. The missionaries use Genesis 17 to say, look at Abraham, he was an adult, do what he did. Paul counters with the rest of the chapter, look at Ishmael, he was an adult, do not do what he did.
Now, you could argue that Paul is just a lone voice in the wilderness here, inventing a really clever technicality to win an argument. Does anyone else in the ancient world read the Bible this way?
That is a great question.
To prove Paul is not just making this up in a vacuum, I think we need to look at how other Jewish thinkers of the era handled the exact same text. You mentioned the book of Jubilees earlier. Can we dig into that?
Yes, the book of Jubilees is vital here. It is a text written a couple of centuries before Paul, during the Second Temple period. It retells the stories of Genesis, but it expands on them to address the concerns of its own day.
And what does it say about the eighth day?
The author of Jubilees fundamentally agrees with Paul's exclusionary reading of Genesis 17. The author stresses that there is no skipping or altering the eighth-day rule. The text explicitly says there is no circumcising of days, nor omitting any day of the 8 days, because it is an eternal ordinance.
They took the timeline incredibly seriously. It was not a suggestion, it was the mechanism itself.
The author of Jubilees uses this rigid eighth-day rule to explicitly exclude Ishmael and Esau from the covenant. Jubilees firmly links genealogy, which is being born to Jewish parents, with the law, which means getting circumcised precisely at 8 days.
For the author of Jubilees, God categorically distinguishes between Jacob's descendants and all other nations. Being born to a Jewish parent and having the rite performed on the 8th day is the only valid entry point.
Right.
Let me make sure I'm tracking this. You are saying Paul, a first-century Christian apostle, and the author of Jubilees, a Jewish writer from centuries earlier, two entirely different thinkers operating in different contexts, arrived at the identical conclusion. They both decided that adult Gentile circumcision is totally useless.
They absolutely did. They shared a baseline understanding of covenant boundaries. The rival missionaries in Galatia viewed Jewish identity as permeable. They believed anyone could join via the physical surgery. It was an open-door policy.
But Paul and the author of Jubilees viewed the covenant as impermeable to adult outsiders via that specific ritual. They recognized that the text of Genesis 17 was designed to show that mimicking the ritual does not change your baseline identity.
Because Ishmael underwent the surgery, but his status remained unchanged. He was still the son of the slave woman. The adult slaves in Abraham's household underwent the surgery, but their status remained unchanged. They remained slaves. They did not become heirs.
Circumcision, when performed outside that tight 8-day window, had zero covenantal value for bringing an outsider into the family.
The boundary was fixed. Paul is leaning on a very established, rigorous, technical reading of the Hebrew scriptures.
Okay, I follow the logic on the 8th-day rule. It makes sense, and it clears Paul of the charge that he is ignoring the text. But there's a wrinkle here. Paul does not just stick to the literal text of Genesis. We hit Galatians chapter 4, and Paul explicitly writes that he is reading the story of Hagar and Sarah allegorically. Modern critics jump all over this. When I hear allegory, I think of someone making up a fairy tale to fit their narrative. Doesn't resorting to allegory prove the literal text doesn't support his argument?
That assumption is common, but it relies entirely on a modern English class definition of the word allegory. Today, when we hear allegory, we think it means the reader invents a fanciful meaning and forces it onto the text. We think of it as creative license that ignores the original author's intent.
So how did an ancient Greek or an ancient Jew define allegory?
We can look at Greco-Roman grammarians from antiquity, figures like Tryphon and Heraclitus, or we could look at the Jewish philosopher Philo, who lived around the same time as Paul. They demonstrated that ancient readers believed the text itself spoke allegorically.
The ancient understanding was that the original author embedded a secondary meaning into the text. Moses, acting under divine inspiration, designed the historical narrative of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar to speak directly to future generations.
So the allegory is a feature of the text itself, not a magic trick performed by the reader. God designed history to echo.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the editors of Genesis likely shaped the Hagar and Ishmael narrative to speak to that specific crisis. Matthew Thiessen's book points out that the later editors of the book of Genesis likely operated on this exact same principle.
Yes, during the Persian period, long after the events of Genesis, Jewish leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah faced a massive crisis. Jewish men were marrying foreign women, and the leaders were demanding they cast out those foreign wives and their mixed offspring to preserve the community's identity.
The story of Abraham casting out the Egyptian slave woman and her son was brought to the forefront to validate the policies of Ezra and Nehemiah's day. The narrative spoke about the distant past, but it mapped perfectly onto their present reality.
Paul is acting in total continuity with those ancient literary practices. He believes the text was designed by God to map perfectly onto the crisis happening right then in Galatia. He's looking at the events of Genesis 16 through 21 and seeing two distinct paths: 2 mothers, 2 missions, and 2 births.
Let's break down those two paths. In Galatians 4, Paul sets up a stark contrast. On one side, you have Hagar, the slave woman. Paul says she represents the missionary's gospel. On the other side, you have Sarah, the free woman, representing Paul's gospel. Why does Hagar represent the missionaries?
We have to look at the narrative of the two births. Hagar's conception of Ishmael in Genesis 16 represents human scheming. Remember the setup. God had promised Abraham an heir, but years pass, and Sarah's womb remains barren. Abraham and Sarah are old. Nothing is happening.
So they decide to force God's promise through natural fleshly means. Sarah says, "Take my slave, sleep with her, and we will build a family through her."
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Sarah taking Hagar, giving her to Abraham, and Abraham listening to her. That sounds incredibly familiar, like the Garden of Eden.
You caught that, yes. If you look at the Greek Septuagint, the language is practically identical to the fall of humanity in Genesis 3. In the Garden of Eden, Eve takes the fruit, gives it to her husband, and Adam listens to the voice of his wife. The author of Genesis is deliberately using the same verbs.
So the author is signaling that Abraham and Sarah's attempt to manufacture an heir through Hagar is not just a minor lapse in judgment. It is a catastrophic failure of faith. It mirrors the original sin. It is human effort trying to seize control of something only God has the right to give.
It is the flesh trying to do the work of the Spirit. Contrast that frantic human effort with Isaac's birth a few chapters later. Isaac's birth involves zero human scheming. Sarah's womb is completely dead. Abraham's body is described as being as good as dead.
There is no natural biological pathway for them to produce a child. Isaac's birth is a miracle brought forth from a dead womb. It is essentially creation out of nothing.
The Jewish philosopher Philo wrote about this. He suggested that Isaac's conception was entirely through divine providence, completely bypassing natural generation. Isaac is born purely according to the Spirit, according to the promise of God, not according to the flesh. He is a walking, breathing miracle.
Okay, I see how this connects to the Galatians. Think about the rival missionaries. Paul is saying they are acting just like Sarah in Genesis 16. The missionaries are looking at these Gentile converts, and they are trying to manually manufacture heirs for Abraham through a physical, fleshly procedure.
Exactly. That is spot on.
They are trying to help God out with a scalpel. They think they can take a Gentile, perform a surgery, and produce a legitimate heir to the covenant. They're relying on human effort, on their own scheming, to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise.
That is the core of Paul's critique. Paul aligns his own mission with Isaac's birth. Paul is watching God miraculously create children of Abraham out of the Gentiles, out of nothing, without any human surgery required. The Galatians, who were spiritually dead in their paganism, have been brought to life by the Spirit.
It is a divine miracle. The missionaries want to drag these miraculous children back into the realm of human scheming. They want to turn Isaac's into Ishmael's, which sets up one of the most misunderstood verses in the entire letter.
Yes, Galatians 5, verse 3.
We reach Galatians 5, verse 3, where Paul issues this famous warning. He says, "I testify again to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law."
And that verse causes so much confusion.
Right, because the traditional view, the one you hear in almost every commentary, says Paul means all 600 plus Jewish laws. It portrays the law as an impossible, crushing burden. The idea is that Paul is warning the Galatians, if you take this one step, you are signing up for an impossible checklist. And since you cannot keep it perfectly, you are doomed.
That traditional view dismantles itself upon close inspection of ancient Judaism. The Jewish law was never designed to be a standard of flawless perfection with no recourse for failure. That is a caricature.
The law contained built-in systems of atonement, sacrifices, and repentance. A Jewish person who failed to keep a commandment was not instantly doomed. They utilized the sacrificial system provided by the grace of the law itself.
Furthermore, Paul himself claimed in his letter to the Philippians that regarding righteousness under the law, he was blameless. He did not view the law as an impossible burden during his life as a Pharisee. He thought he kept it pretty well.
So reading Galatians 5, verse 3 as a threat about 600 impossible rules makes very little historical sense. It does not fit Paul's own biography.
This is where Thiessen provides two alternative linguistic readings for what Paul means by the whole law. First, the whole law might mean the entire law of circumcision. Let us examine that.
Okay, break that down for me.
The law of circumcision is not just about the physical cutting of the flesh. It is a complex set of stipulations, primarily focused on timing. By getting circumcised as an adult, you instantly fail the whole law of circumcision because you missed the eighth-day requirement.
You break the law in the very act of trying to keep it. You step up to the plate, and you strike out before you even swing.
There is a brilliant anecdote from the Tosefta, an ancient rabbinic text, that illustrates how strictly the Jewish community held to this specific timing. The story involves a woman in the region of Cappadocia. She gave birth to a son, circumcised him on the 8th day, and the baby tragically died.
Oh, that is awful.
It is. Later, she gave birth to a second son, circumcised him on the 8th day, and he also died. She gave birth to a third son. Because of the previous tragedies, she brought the child to a rabbi for guidance.
A completely understandable reaction. She is terrified.
The rabbi noticed the baby was green, lacking proper blood flow, and told her to wait to circumcise him until his color improved, until he was healthy enough to survive the blood loss. But the takeaway from the story is the mother's initial action.
The fact that she circumcised the first two babies on the 8th day, even knowing it might be life-threatening, shows the absolute severity of the 8th day requirement. You could not just pick a random day that was convenient. The entire law of circumcision hinged on that specific temporal window.
So Paul is telling the Galatian adult, if you undergo this surgery now, you fare the law of circumcision instantly. You cannot obey the whole law of circumcision because you are 30 years late.
But there is a second alternative reading Thiessen offers for the whole law, and this one feels like a massive mic drop. The whole law might refer to the entire narrative of Genesis 16 through 21.
Remember, earlier in chapter 4, Paul calls the Genesis narrative the law when he says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law?" He uses the word law to refer to the Torah, the books of Moses, specifically the story of Abraham.
So if a Galatian adult gets circumcised, they are stepping into the shoes of Ishmael in that narrative. But wait, we know how that story ends. What happens at the end of the narrative in Genesis 21?
The narrative ends with a feast. Isaac is weaned, and Sarah observes Ishmael. She does not like what she sees. She commands Abraham to cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman.
And God explicitly tells Abraham to listen to Sarah's voice in this matter. Eviction is the mandatory conclusion of the story for Ishmael.
So if a Galatian gets circumcised, they become a modern-day Ishmael, and the very law they are trying to obey demands their own eviction from the household. They are signing their own deportation papers.
They think they are earning an inheritance, but they are actually triggering the clause that casts them out of the family. The irony is staggering.
It is a devastating theological argument. Paul is showing them that their chosen method of inclusion is actually the scriptural mechanism for exclusion. They are actively orchestrating their own removal from the promises of God.
Which brings us to another highly debated verse, Galatians 6, verse 13, where Paul writes that those who circumcise themselves do not keep the law. Modern interpreters often assume this is just a generic statement about all Jewish people failing to keep the rules perfectly. They think Paul is saying, nobody is perfect.
But that ignores the specific grammar of the text, right? I know we do not want to get bogged down in Greek grammar, but slow this down for me. We are looking at a specific phrase, the Greek present participle, peritemnomenoi. Let's strip away the academic jargon.
Yeah, please translate that into plain English.
The grammatical construction indicates middle voice, reflexive action. That means it describes someone doing an action to themselves or for themselves. These are not Jewish infants having the rite performed on them by their parents. Paul is speaking directly to the Galatian situation, referencing adult men actively taking it upon themselves to submit to the knife.
It is an active present pursuit.
Yes, this is not a blanket statement that Jews cannot follow rules. It is a targeted statement about adult Gentiles actively seeking surgery. The very moment the scalpel touches an adult Gentile, they are breaking the law they are trying to keep, because the law demands the subject be 8 days old.
The action itself is the transgression. It is not that they get circumcised and then fail to keep the Sabbath a week later. The surgery itself is the violation of the law.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that Paul's anger mirrors Sarah's anger. In Genesis 21, the text says, Sarah sees Ishmael playing. And what does that mean?
Right, because playing sounds pretty innocent.
In ancient Jewish interpretations, like the Tosefta Sota, this playing is understood as Ishmael pretending to be the heir. He is claiming he will inherit a double portion as the firstborn. He is play-acting at being Isaac.
Sarah demands he be cast out for this presumption. She won't tolerate a fake heir threatening the true, miraculous heir. Paul is furious at these Gentile believers because they are doing the exact same thing.
They are play-acting as Jews.
Okay.
They are undergoing a ritual that does not belong to them, pretending to be native-born heirs, and in doing so, they are mocking the miraculous spirit-driven birth that God actually granted them.
They are trading the reality of a divine miracle for the costume of human effort. It is an affront to the grace they have received. But this raises a massive logical loophole, one that any sharp listener is probably screaming at their audio player right now.
I can guess what it is.
If adult circumcision makes you an Ishmael, what about Abraham? He was 99 years old when he was circumcised. Doesn't that prove adult circumcision has value? Doesn't Abraham's example destroy Paul's entire argument?
It is the most obvious counterargument. The rival missionaries surely used it. They likely said Abraham was 99. We are just following the patriarch. Paul anticipates this objection. To find his answer, we have to pivot slightly to his letter to the Romans.
Specifically Romans chapter 4, where he tackles this exact timeline. Paul points out a crucial sequence of events. Abraham was declared righteous by God in Genesis 15, years before he was ever circumcised in Genesis 17.
The text explicitly says Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He was a completely uncircumcised Gentile when God made that declaration. The covenant was secured by faith prior to any physical action.
This chronological fact makes Abraham the father of believing uncircumcised Gentiles. Paul isolates the moment of justification and proves it had nothing to do with surgery. It was based entirely on God's sovereign promise and Abraham's trust in that promise.
Okay, that secures the Gentiles. But that still leaves a massive question. Why did God command the surgery later then?
Right. If he was already righteous, why did God demand the cutting of the flesh at age 99? If the physical act wasn't necessary for his standing before God, why introduce it at all?
God commanded it so Abraham could also be the father of circumcised Jews. The late circumcision turns Abraham into a split paradigm. He operates as the father to two distinct groups.
Early Christian thinker Origen beautifully summarized this concept. He wrote that through faith, Abraham is the father of the uncircumcised. Through the flesh, he is the father of the circumcised.
God gave Abraham the sign of circumcision later, so that his physical descendants, the Jewish people, would have a distinct, abiding marker of their historical identity.
So Paul maintains a strict distinction. Circumcision retains its massive, continuing value for Jewish identity. Paul is not anti-Jewish. He isn't saying the law is bad or that God made a mistake in Genesis 17.
He simply believes that for a Gentile to steal that identity is a category error. Applying a kosher slaughtering ritual to a pig does not yield kosher meat. It just yields a dead pig. Applying circumcision to a Gentile does not yield a Jew. It just yields a bleeding Gentile. The boundaries remain distinct.
That is the crucial synthesis. God calls Gentiles to be children of Abraham through faith, mirroring the miracle of Isaac's birth, without needing to cross the boundary line into Jewish ethnic identity.
Paul is defending the integrity of both groups. He is defending the distinctiveness of the Jewish people who carry the mark of the covenant in their flesh, and he is defending the miraculous inclusion of the Gentiles, who are grafted in solely by the action of the Spirit.
The missionaries were trying to erase the distinction, forcing Gentiles to assimilate. Paul recognizes that true unity does not require the obliteration of historical covenantal distinctions.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have. Let's summarize this deep dive. We started with Paul being accused of twisting scripture, of performing hermeneutical jujitsu to force his own views onto the text. But after looking at the mechanics of his argument, we end by seeing Paul as a master exegete.
He was not ignoring the text. He was reading it closer than anyone else. He recognized that Genesis 17's eighth-day clause, Ishmael's exclusion despite his surgery, and the miraculous nature of Isaac's birth all harmonized to prove one point.
And that point is that Gentiles are saved by a divine miracle, not by mimicking a ritual meant for biological descendants. His logic is tight.
He takes the very text his opponents are using and demonstrates that their own proof text condemns their mission. He shows that taking human action to secure divine promises always leads to the birth of an Ishmael, a child of slavery.
So what does this all mean? In the end, it means we must read historical texts in their actual historical context. Paul wasn't attacking Judaism as some outdated religion. He was settling an internal, highly specific debate about how Gentiles fit into a Jewish worldview.
He was protecting Gentiles from a heavy burden that was never meant for them, while upholding the validity of the covenant God made with Israel.
It challenges us to look beyond surface-level readings. When we see a conflict in these ancient texts, it is often a signal that we are missing the cultural and literary context.
Paul's use of allegory wasn't an escape hatch. It was an established, rigorous method of pulling the intended meaning out of the text, seeing how God's patterns in history repeat themselves.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder based on the source text, something that brings this ancient debate right into our modern laps. Consider the concept of Ishmael's boast.
That is a great angle to close on.
In the ancient Aramaic Targum Theodojonathan, there's a fascinating expansion of the Genesis narrative. It depicts an argument between Ishmael and Isaac over who is the true heir. Ishmael argues with Isaac, claiming he's superior because he willingly chose the pain of circumcision at age 13.
He argues that he consciously submitted to the knife. He made a sacrifice. He bled for God, whereas Isaac was just a clueless 8-day-old baby who made no choice and felt no conscious devotion.
Ishmael appeals to his own human merit, his own pain, his own sacrifice as the reason he should inherit. Isaac had nothing to boast about except the fact that he was the child of a miracle. He contributed nothing to his own status.
Ask yourself this: how often do modern systems of thought rely on Ishmael's boast? The desire to earn our status through our own painful efforts, our own discipline, our own measurable sacrifices, rather than simply receiving a promise we did absolutely nothing to earn.
That tension is always with us. We want to contribute to our own rescue. We want the credit of the 13-year-old Ishmael, not the complete helplessness of the 8-day-old Isaac.
We are constantly tempted to trust the flesh, to grab the scalpel ourselves, to manufacture our own security. But the text calls us to trust the miracle instead.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Galatian crisis. We are leaving you with plenty to mull over until next time. Keep reading, keep questioning, and keep thinking.